Hey everybody, my name is Dom. In this video, I want to present my understanding of damage interactivity and offer one way to apply that understanding on a practical level. The information will progress from simple no-duh type of basics into what I hope can be considered an intermediate application of that knowledge. I will be using specific decks from a variety of formats to illustrate my points. Feel free to skip to different chapters of the video if you feel something is too simple, but note that I will be introducing some vocabulary that I continue to use throughout the video. Let's start by going through some fundamentals. To my knowledge, there are two forms of damage in this game: combat damage and non-combat damage. If you know of a third, enlighten me. Combat damage comes in two camps. There are followers that need to survive a turn before they can go face, and followers that don't. The followers with Storm. Non-combat damage is pretty much just burn, and I will use the terms interchangeably. There is design space for burn-adjacent effects like Azazel Evo, which are technically not burn on a rules level, but in practice, all non-combat damage is just a flavor of burn. For the purposes of this video, I would like to present this as a potential definition of damage interactivity, an idea that we can reference while breaking down the forms of damage. The interactivity of damage is a characteristic or measurement of the quantity and variety of responses an opponent has to mitigate, prevent, or survive through damage. Keeping that definition in mind, let's look at the different options we have for interacting with combat damage. First and foremost, we have wards. So long as we maintain a ward on our field, the overwhelming majority of followers will not be able to damage our leader. Paired with a wide variety of removal options, we can see the basic level 1 form of interaction. If our opponent plays a follower, we can play a ward, or we can use removal. If we're worried about Storm, we can play a ward, or we can float play points for removal. Healing is a form of interaction in that it helps us to survive through damage. But it is important to make the extra time we buy with healing worth something, as healing on its own does not prevent the damage from occurring again. Occasionally, very specific interaction tools like Realm of Repose or Mark of the Six are printed that mitigate damage, but they are not a widespread form of interaction. It is worth noting that just because we may have the ability to interact with damage at any given point in time, it is not always the correct choice. In many cases, this will be based on value or efficiency. Obviously, you don't need to snap off a Themis' Decree to remove a board that only consists of a single goblin. Other times, we simply need to save a limited removal option for a high priority threat. For example, against Natura Sword, you could use Surefire Bullet to respond to Swift Tigress and prevent 4 damage. But maybe you need to save that bullet for a Maisha plus Encroaching Heat combo to prevent a silly but somehow not unrealistic 18 damage. Non-combat damage is much more limited in its interactions. For the vast majority of decks, you're basically limited to healing out of lethal range. Most decks can't stop the burn from coming, and they just need to do what they can to live through it. Every deck has access to Lyriel as a direct counter to burn, but not every deck can afford to include her, and even if you do, you won't always draw her. Some decks have access to other specific tools to prevent burn, but generally, burn can be considered almost completely uninteractive. That does not mean there is no counterplay. It just means you cannot directly interact with it. The best way to handle burn is effectively utilizing indirect interactions. When I say indirect interaction, I'm mostly thinking about racing and presenting trades. Rather than relying exclusively on direct defensive actions to prevent damage, making strong offensive plays can be just as effective while also allowing you to advance your own win condition. Building a threatening board can be enough to get your opponent to take low damage lines of play. Maybe they need to use followers that survived a turn to trade instead of going face. Maybe they use followers with Storm to trade. Maybe they have to play removal or set up wards. Maybe they want to play Silverbolt 2 turns in a row. But if they know they can't afford to take the damage that ignoring your board would cost them, you can take that option off the table. A card that exemplifies this well is Roach. Roach has the ability to gain Storm. It represents a source of combat damage that you could prevent directly via wards or quick removal. But this is not the primary way that we avoid taking damage from Roach. Usually, Roach damage is prevented by presenting the forest player with a board that incentivizes them to use Roach's removal mode instead. For example, let's say Machina Haven spends their turn on Lamonia and replays a Robo Falcon with her effect. Forest could do something like Fairy, Roach, Elf Song, Evo the Roach, gain Storm, and get in for 4 damage. Or they could use the removal effect of Roach to kill Lamonia then attack the Falcon with Roach to clear board. If Forest does not clear the board, they're leaving a minimum of 7 damage on the table. Most likely, Forest will choose to clear board in that spot. The Haven player effectively prevented 4 damage in this scenario. Lamonia could have pulled back a ward in Iron Knuckle None and stopped Roach from going face that way, but we can see from this example that sometimes direct interaction is not necessary to minimize damage intake. This particular form of interaction is among the reasons that going first is so powerful. When you take the initiative, you are the one asking your opponent to give up their potential damage. I know people love their Evo points, and they are useful, but their strength is a reflection of how powerful this indirect form of interaction is. Those Evo points are what it takes to give the player going second a chance at becoming the one who forces the trades, and even then, they aren't always enough. To me, the biggest factor in deciding to go first or second in a matchup is which position can most easily leverage this type of interaction. I think it could be helpful to visualize a gradient of interactivity and some of the attributes of cards that affect their interactivity. We can start by creating some anchor points for reference. The least interactive damage is burn. Your direct options are basically just healing, which is technically applicable against everything. On the opposite end, the most interactive form of damage is followers on board with no special traits. Storm can be seen as a modifier trait that restricts interactions to preemptive options. There are some other modifier traits for followers too. One is being overstated. While your opponent might have the opportunity to use slow removal, non-quick removal, it doesn't matter if the removal is not strong enough. During set 1, if Dirt went first and dropped a Runic Guardian on 3, if they had this standing 4/6 threat, if you weren't playing Dragon and you weren't playing Forest, good luck getting this thing off the board. While technically this threat is reactable, you have the same amount of time as you would to deal with a Goblin, the raw stat value restricts the amount of options that can actually prevent that damage. Similarly, Aura is another modifier that restricts the amount of valid responses to a threat. You could argue whether a specific overstated follower or an Aura follower are easier or harder to deal with, but I think it's fair to say generally Aura is less interactive than an overstated follower. You could apply these same concepts to Storm followers. During set 3, if Sword hit Heroic Entry into Mach Knight on 3, there weren't a lot of options to stop that damage from coming through. Uma had an answer, but that was about it. The Holy Grail, Storm plus Aura. We all know how difficult preventing a Forte swing can be. You basically just have to ward and hope they can't kill that ward before they attack. From this point on, if I say uninteractive damage, I'll be referring to Storm and Burn with kind of an implication that the Storm is for more than 3 damage. If I say interactive damage, I basically just mean combat damage without Storm or small amounts of chip Storm. Let's run through some miscellaneous points I want to touch on before wrapping up this conceptual segment. Interactivity is positively correlated with reactivity. That is to say, the more interactive a source of damage is, the more opportunity we have to respond to it. Inversely, we could say the less interactive damage is, the more our answers need to happen preemptively. This makes uninteractive damage very dangerous. If a deck has access to Storm and Burn at the same time, you might choose to give up an opportunity to heal so that you can float removal and then just lose to Burn. But what if you do heal and then you take a Storm hit? Now you need to remove a follower that already got its damage in. You're getting 2 for 1 in terms of damage mapping and threat to removal alignment. That's where balancing comes in. And I mean balancing both in terms of the way the designers create cards and the way that players build their decks. Highly interactive cards are allowed to have a higher ceiling on their damage, a higher count of total potential damage. Leveraging a Storm threat alongside Burn is great, but the amount of damage needs to be high enough to win the game. Forest has a trio of finishers to illustrate this concept. Silverbolt is a potent burn card. You're often getting between 6 and 8 damage from this card. King Elephant is a big Storm card. It is also frequently going to hit for 6 to 8 damage, but it's cheaper than Silverbolt, and it has more utility as a bouncer. Those perks come at the price of increased interactivity. A little Bellringer Angel is enough to stop a King Elephant on curve. A late game Elephant has the potential to hit way harder than a Silverbolt, but that's because the decks that push into the late game are more likely to be running high potency removal like execution variants, and they have the means to float play points to use them. Deepwood Anomaly is by far the most interactive of the three. It is very difficult to expect this card to survive for a turn and then go face. But what if it does? This card deals infinite damage. No life total is high enough to survive a Deepwood swing. You could play defense all game long and still win the moment you get a Deepwood to connect. Bolt and Elephant both need you to find other threats to add up to lethal. Of course, there are other aspects of a card that balance its damage quantity. Things like cost, archetype restrictions, and setup conditions. But I still think recognizing this trend can be impactful to your deck building. Leaning too hard into uninteractive damage might make it difficult to win against decks with strong defense. Not including any uninteractive damage can make it difficult to close out games. Fablehaven is a great example of why this matters. That deck was much stronger in set 4 than it was when it released in set 3. The deck was heavily focused on burn, and burn is answered by healing. During set 3, Forest could loop Marvelous Sunday. Discard Dragon was on Olivia, Shenlong, maybe Lucifer, or Super Creek. Against enough healing, Fablehaven could find itself running out of damage. What changed in set 4? Andromeda. Andromeda drastically increased the deck's capacity of interactive combat damage. She added another 1-drop to help make the curve more consistent, and she allowed the deck to build threatening boards on Humpty Dumpty turns. Healing is still effective against Fablehaven, but demanding other decks to answer the board made finding time to apply that healing more difficult. I'm sure you can think of other times that decks were improved by gaining access to more types of damage that they were lacking. With all of that conceptual information laid out, what do we do with it? How do we make this useful? How do we put it into practice and apply it directly to the game? I like to start by making the claim that our least interactive damage is our most reliable damage. We can operate under the assumption that the damage is effectively guaranteed. If we're not getting it, we are likely losing the game. For many decks, we can plan for this damage to be the final blow. What this allows us to do is start calculating our lethal in reverse. This is easiest to apply to decks that include burn. Let's say we include Demonic Strike in our deck and expect to use it every game. If that 3 damage is assumed to be guaranteed, we don't need to plan 20 damage. We need to plan out 17 damage. We can then continue to apply this concept to the remaining 17 damage. What is our next least interactive source of damage? Thinking back to the spectrum I laid out earlier, that will usually be some kind of storm. Let's say we get 7 points of storm damage. That leaves us with 10 damage that we need to find through our most interactive sources. If we know that our deck only needs us to find 10 interactive damage, we can better plan how to race our opponents and how much we can afford to trade. It might sound like I just pulled some made-up numbers out of thin air, but what if I listed off Razor Claw, Phantom Howl, Playful Necromancer, Soul Dealer, Skeleton Fighter? Suddenly, those numbers don't sound so random anymore. Instead of starting with your least interactive damage, you could also start by looking at your highest quantity of damage, and then use uninteractive damage to fill in the gap to 20. If after looking at your primary source of damage, you don't see a realistic way to get to 20, or you think it'll take too long to get to 20, or if you won't be able to punch too far above 20 to compensate for healing, your deck might have some problems at the archetype or deck building level that need to be addressed. Of course, this is a simplified thought process. Not every deck runs burn. Not every deck has storm. I didn't really make direct compensations for healing. Sometimes you don't draw as much of your damage as you want. That's where the game gets interesting though. Deviating from your default game plan to accommodate for your opponent's interaction, adapting based on the order of your draws. Some decks have narrow game plans, while others are incredibly flexible. Different decks lean harder into different areas of the interactivity spectrum. To me, that's what makes this game interesting. Now, I want to look at a couple decks and specific ways to form a game plan using this style of thinking in the context of those decks. Set 1 Force is a great deck to start with. What's the biggest source of damage in that deck? what is the least interactive damage in that deck? What is usually going to end the game? That's your Thornburst tokens. A single Rose Queen generating a full EX area represents 15 damage. That is a lot. What's the next biggest source of damage? Silverbolt. Let's say you get 7 to 9 damage from a bolt. This is a variable source of damage. It could be less, but even if you only deal 5, alongside your 5 Thornbursts, that is enough to get to 20. Admittedly, that is a lot of expensive cards in the late game that are not interacting with your opponent's damage. It's going to take 3 turns to get the bolt and all of your Thornbursts out. Maybe that's not practical in a given matchup. Well, 15 damage from the Rose Queen is only 5 away from 20, and conveniently, Ancient Elf Evo with the double bounce has 5 attack. Ancient Elf can be considered slightly overstated. It is very reasonable to get in for 5 with an early game Ancient Elf. Assuming the opponent never heals, connecting with that one Ancient Elf is enough to let you remove Silverbolt from the equation and focus the entire rest of the game on surviving long enough to use all 5 Thornbursts. Having a clear vision of your road to 20 damage like this makes you less likely to make a mistake in the Indirect Interaction department, in the racing department. You won't come up short on damage if you effectively plan out your lethal early on. Of course, more often than not, decks have multiple avenues to lethal. You can and should shift between them or mix and match as the game goes on. Usually this starts to happen when your unreliable sources of damage start to get through, when your more interactive damage connects. Let's say Forest gets in for 4 damage with an evolved Rose Gardener. That changes your math when you start to think about racing. Earlier, I used Roach to demonstrate how building boards can mitigate damage. In that example, Roach was used as removal instead of a storm threat because the Forest player could not afford to ignore the board. But if an unexpected 4 damage came from a Rose Gardener, we can see how that risk evaluation might change. A turn 8 Rose Queen lets you play 2 Thornbursts. You're getting 6 burn on turn 8. 6 Thornburst damage plus 4 from Rose Gardener is 10. Add 5 from an early game Ancient Elf and we have 15. Maybe a normal game would require a turn 7 Roach to be used as removal, since you would expect to need to see both turns 8 and 9 to fire off all 5 Thornbursts. But what if you only need to see turn 8? Now you could make a play that gets Roach to 5 attack, and suddenly you have the extra 5 damage to get from 15 to 20. As I said earlier, cards that fall more on the interactive side of the spectrum tend to be allowed to have higher counts of damage, or hit high counts of damage earlier. They may be less reliable than your uninteractive sources of damage, but getting in hefty chunks of damage that your opponent could have prevented allows you to make game-winning pushes earlier and earlier in the game. That strength compensates for the lack of reliability. Not all decks work like this one. They don't all start by having a mathed out win and threatening the opponent with interactive damage to accelerate that clock. Some do, D-Shift being a notable one that does, but there are plenty that index harder on the interactive side of things and challenge their opponent to have enough interactions to survive. Set 2 Sword is one of those decks. The deck could consistently put out threats and test the limits of your direct interaction. Turn 2 Latham is pretty easy to answer with a surefire bullet. So is a turn 3 Novice Trooper. Can you always answer both? No. Sword could reasonably expect at least one of these cards to connect, because decks wouldn't always have the right answer for both cards back to back. This does make it hard to math out a game plan though. If you don't know if you're getting 2 or 3 or 6 damage in the early game, how do you know how much damage your late game needs to offer? Honestly, you don't. And that's why a threat like Leonidas makes so much sense for the deck. Rather than planning around a stable count of uninteractive damage to close the game, building around Leonidas doubles down on the idea of pushing an opponent's ability to interact to its limit. It doubles down on the idea that despite being hard to plan around, highly interactive damage offers a large quantity or efficiency of damage. Floral Fencer, after a Leonidas resolve hits the board, represents 16 damage. For 4 play points, that is a very good rate. If you don't know how much damage you can count on, having the potential for overkill, like an unanswered 16 damage, helps. A deck like this is also more prone to shifting between game plans, depending on how much interactive damage connects. For Sword in particular, having access to a variety of tutors and strong tutor targets keeps multiple lethal lines on the table. An Avant Blader could search double Novice Trooper, double Quick Blader, or maybe one of each, or even the aforementioned 16 damage Floral Fencer, based on the game state. At 7 play points, Albert is a committal play, but dangling a potential 12 storm damage over the opponent's head can make them more cautious about ignoring board and attempting to race. Set 3 Dirt sits somewhere between the two previous decks in terms of the ability to plan for reliable damage and incorporating various levels of interactivity. I recognize that all three of these decks are from older formats, but the designers pretty clearly kept the early formats more simple and created archetypes with more clear-cut game plans. We'll wrap up with the Set 7 deck here in a moment. Dirt is generally known as a burn deck, but it's pretty distinct for Bros Queen in that department. Dirt is more of an incremental burn deck. Ancient Alchemist is the deck's big burn finisher, but she only deals 6 damage. And that's because she also offers follow-up interactive damage through the board presence she generates. She helps in racing scenarios by creating wards, and generally just offers a lot of flexibility. Her damage is reliable, but the quantity is relatively low, and you need to find more damage elsewhere. That's a general theme for Dirt on the whole. You have a wide variety of cards that are relatively reliable, but you need multiples to get the job done. You'd need to chain together a diverse set of cards to build the full lethal game plan. Burn is just one part of the puzzle. The deck has a real reliance on scoring some amount of interactive damage. For Set 3 Dirt specifically, I think it's best to take the approach of starting from the end. Ancient Alchemist offers 6 damage. Merlin represents an alternative for the same cost and damage. Erasmus the turn prior would give you 4 damage, bringing the count to 10. Rico is a fantastic card for the deck. Her 3 burn brings the total to 13 damage. That's a nice 6-7-8 curve that simultaneously interacts with the board. Now we just need 7 damage from the early game to get to 20, and then we can think about how to adjust for healing, which usually just means an extra Ancient Alchemist or a Merlin. Since Set 1, Runic Guardian was a staple of the Dirt early game. Her stats made her a relatively reliable 4 damage at the time. Felice was a boon from Set 3. An overstatted 4-drop to follow an overstatted 3-drop made 8 damage on turn 4 very realistic. And a follow-up 4 damage from one of the 2 surviving was not unheard of. There are a couple of issues with this plan. The sequence requires 5 stacks, and the only turns available to generate those stacks in this plan are turns 1, 2, and 5. The damage barely reaches 20. If we miss a stack on one of those crucial turns, or don't have all of the cards on curve, the damage becomes increasingly difficult to apply. There are cards that mitigate this. Remy and Rami might chip in for a little damage here and there. They might let you skip an Erasmus or Rico. A little bit of crafty Warlock damage could help you shave off one of these breakpoints or eat into the opponent's healing. But in general, being forced to eat into a very tight damage budget by an opponent's indirect interactions could draw this deck into a top deck contest. With this deck, I want to re-emphasize how important it is to keep racing or forcing respect for damage in mind on a deck construction level. Again, this Rico Erasmus Alchemist curve is only 13 damage. Without including cards like Runic Guardian to fight for the early game, what's stopping the opponent from taking high damage lines of play over more defensive, low damage ones? What's stopping the opponent from just letting you hit them because they know they will win first? If we fast forward to Set 7 Dirt, is Riley a scary card on turn 6 if the opponent is at 20 life? I don't think so. Another deck that can get into trouble because of a narrow lethal plan is Natura Forest. The big play this deck has is Latic Ascendum packing, which will usually wipe the board and then get in for 7 damage. An overstatted Storm Follower that is not stopped by wards. Think about how far that shifts Latica to the right side of the interactivity spectrum. That is pretty uninteractive. But what is the drawback of uninteractive damage? The count is generally low. Consider that pulling off 3 Latica combos is only 21 damage. Most decks this format will be playing with more than 21 life. 25 is a pretty realistic number to start at. That is a problem for this deck to solve. Imagine a game where every Latica gets answered by a Viridia Magna. What you gonna do about that? And the math gets even trickier when we consider the third Latica can be difficult to get to. So sometimes we have a 14 damage starting point instead of 21. There are options on a deck building level to add a little bit more hard to interact with damage to the deck. Some lists run Ancient Elf for its synergy with the trees, Colorful Cook, things like that. I think Suzuka is not a controversial inclusion. Some more spicy cards are Ivy Spellbomb or Nelcha. But even with these inclusions, the deck can struggle to kill without getting some amount of incremental hits with cards like Colorful Cook or Desert Pathfinder in the early to mid game. I don't want to undersell this deck, but I do think it does a good job of demonstrating how interactivity directly relates to what types of problems your deck will need to solve in deck building. Let's wrap up with a quick review of some key takeaways. Indirect interactions can often be more effective than direct interactions and are the key to navigating matchups between high interactivity strategies. Damage quantity tends to decrease as interactivity decreases. This leads to low interactivity game plans struggling with narrow lethal margins. If you are struggling against a deck that restricts your ability to interact, consider how you might exploit that lack of damage. If you're struggling to kill with the deck, consider including more options for interactive damage and find ways to facilitate them. If you think some of my points could be better qualified, please do add on to them. Even if you don't fully agree with my interpretation of the fundamental mechanics, or if you don't think the way I approach game plans is the best one, I think it's valuable to understand how potential opponents might be approaching the game. Maybe you can predict non-standard inclusions that address some deck weaknesses. Don't be surprised if you run into a dirt player still running Rico. Thanks for watching the video. Hopefully you found something useful.